To the east, our ecosystem, our whole ecosystem is known as Cascadia. So Cascadia describes a bioregion that goes from the Pacific Ocean to the Rocky Mountains, roughly speaking, where the state of Oregon and North California up to into Alaska. And it's largely on the coast, temperate rainforest. So I live in a temperate rainforest. Some of the wettest places on Earth are to the west of me, on the west side of our island, Vancouver Island. So when I think about my ecosystem, I think about things such as the ocean and the impact it has on climate and resources. I think about the mountains and the rivers that come down from the mountains, and the fact that climate change is affecting the glaciers that feed the rivers that are major salmon streams. I think about the potential impact of an earthquake. I think about the rainforest and all of its inhabitants. And then I think about the cities, which in another way are another form of ecosystem. They're ones that we've created, but they're still a form of ecosystem. They sit within this large bioregion. So when I think about my health, I need to think about all those sorts of things. So tell me, what's your ecosystem?
Thanks, Trevor. So I'm currently living in Malaysia, in Peninsular Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and that is historically a tropical rainforest where we're located, a river valley, and Malaysia, as you may know, is a mega diverse country, but the landscape in Kuala Lumpur is very old, and it was first tin mining, and now a very large city with a documented population of more than 8 million people, but perhaps with an additional 50% informal population. And we're at the moment in that part of Asia very challenged by evolution associated with that land use change, both in Malaysia but also in neighbouring Indonesia. And so on many days, we're breathing very polluted air from what is euphemistically called a haze that blows across and then blows up against the hills at the back of that river valley where we live, and sits there until it rains or it changes direction. So that's some examples of the things that I need to think about in my ecosystem.
So, any volunteers? If I don't get a volunteer, I'm just going to give this to someone. There you go.
Since India is biodiverse, I would consider myself in the region I live. I live in Mumbai. It is the commercial capital of India, and we have the Arabian Sea, the coastal Arabian Sea, and it's also the Western Ghats. So there's not very high mountains, but little ranges of hills which drop in the mountains and drop into the sea, like directly steep mountains. We also have the largest slum in Asia, that's the Kharavi slum, I'm sure you've heard of it. The largest dumping ground in Asia, that's the Deona dumping ground. It's also the largest dumping ground in Asia. And we also have a very stratified population, from the richest of the rich, including all the industrialists living south of Bombay, the South Bombay, to newer parts of Bombay, Navi Mumbai, and it's one of the most dense populated city in India. Nevertheless, the place it receives rainfall for 4 months of the year, and those 4 months people can be rest assured for the supply of drinking water. The rest of the year is completely dry and it's hot and humid. So drinking water, fresh drinking water is a terrible problem there, which has been tried to be assessed many ways, but still remains unsolved. Also, living conditions and sanitation conditions are compromised for most of the population because the migrant population is by huge and far overnumbering the local people living there. But it's a beautiful city. Thank you.
So a quick question for you. What about ocean rising? With climate change, is that a concern?
There is undocumented oil spills. So if you go to the coastline, to any beach, because most of the coastline is on the beach area, there is sparkly with stones, and it's made into a highway there like this. It's called the Queen's Necklace. So you can see oil spills there, which are not documented because they're largely private ships, naval ships, merchant ships, and also the whole garbage, the whole untreated sewage of Mumbai flows into the sea, untreated totally. So around sunset, if you want to see how the sun melts into the sky, you should, along with that, you see how the sewage is being dispersed into the water and that black line which goes and engorges the sea. So that is disturbing, yes.
Yeah, it's a journey to fish.
And they used to put river in Delhi called the Meaty River, sweet in Hindi. Alright, and parts of the river, initial parts of the river are still usable for human consumption, I guess. But now it's one of the biggest drains in India. It's called the Nadar drain. And it goes and drains into another big drain called the Yamuna River. Alright, the Yamuna is very shallow, owing to the number of dams upstream. By the time it enters Delhi, it becomes really shallow. And although the government has not people trying to use a lot of campaigns for trying to treat the sewage that flows in the river, it's not treated at all. Because most of the colonies around the river, they are unauthorized. And they just dump the water. So it's a very, very dirty river. I know this because I have to go across the Yamuna to work in India. So the smell is, it's very strong and typical, and it enters the AC networks that travel. It's that strong.
So for air, this is air pollution, this is water pollution, this is rainfall or maybe not rainfall because of climate change, rising sea levels, polluted fish sources. Anybody else? Yes, there you go. Go ahead.
I am from Hyderabad. It's about southern India. We don't have a sea nearby. We don't have a sea nearby. And our state is altitude. So we have winds and breezes. We have two kinds of winds. So the monsoon lasts for 4 to 5 months a year. The cyclones. And then yeah, and we have a lot of epidemics which are related to waterborne diseases. Yes, chikungunya, swine flu, influenza, respiratory fevers, yeah, and communicable diseases. They're there. And ours was Nizam ruled city. Nizam's ruled our city. So the customs are even followed right now. And because of that, the food, treatment of the food before eating, and all these things have wrong. And then the maximum temperatures would be around 40 degrees centigrade. I don't know in Fahrenheit because we do it in centigrade. Yeah, it's hot. It's hot. Yeah, thank you.
That concern us when we work in the area of the ecological determinants of health. And I'm going to talk about what some of those ecological determinants are. We've talked about a number of them already. And some of the changes that we are seeing globally, which are being driven by economic and social development. So the downside of economic and social development is the harm it does to the ecosystems that ultimately are our source of life. So that's going to present some challenges. So, I'm skip past that. So this is a picture of where we live. This is home. This is our home. It's our only home. There are no other livable planets around. And that becomes a bit of a problem when we start to exhaust this home, which is what we're doing. This actually came from a report that I was involved with in Canada almost 25 years ago now, where we started to look at what we call human and ecosystem health and the interaction between them. And this is very important because by going to the moon, for the first time we saw the planet as it really is. little blue dot hanging in space, small and quite fragile. We don't often think of the Earth in those terms, or we didn't. But if you think about it, we evolved within natural ecosystems. We are creatures of natural ecosystems. We're not just social animals, as I said, we're ecological animals. And for most of human history, we view nature with a sense of awe, of sometimes of reverence. We worship nature, sometimes in fear of what nature could do to us. But we always saw nature as bigger than us. That's changed in the last 50 or 100 years, 200 years, where now we've come to develop an attitude that we actually are superior to nature. Somehow we are separate from nature, that there's nature out there and then there's people and societies. They're not connected. And we're wrong if we believe that. We are still subject to the laws of nature. And this is a very famous quote from the First Nations and Aboriginal chief in part of North America where I live, in fact, Seattle. The city of Seattle is named after this man, after Chief Seattle. Because Chief Seattle said about 150 years ago, whatever we do to the web of life, we do to ourselves. We need to understand ourselves within that web of life. But what we're actually doing is we've become so powerful that the geologists are discussing creating a new geological era. So you know about the Holocene, the Pleistocene, and all of these geological eras. They're now suggesting that we are entering what they call the Anthropocene, that we're having such an impact on the planet that in the geological record, millions of years from now, you'll be able to see where humanity started to have an impact. We are there in the geology of the Earth that represent our dimension of the Earth. That is awesome power, but it's also a very scary power. And so we need to understand that and come to terms with it. Part of what motivates those of us who work in this area is that public health over the last 20 or 30 years in particular has become very fixed on the social determinants of health. You just had an entire day on social determinants, and I'm not suggesting that they're not important, they're very important. But we focus so much on that we've actually forgotten, become blind to ecological determinants of health. And so what we're saying is, not only do we have to understand the ecological determinants of health, but we also have to understand how they are then linked to the social determinants, because the two interact. So here are some of the things. This comes from a report that I've been leading. We've been developing this report through the Canadian Public Health Association for 3 years now. It's about to come out this spring. And we started it because it had been 20 years since our early report that I mentioned. It was time to revisit this. And stuff of life. The most important determinants of health are air, water, and food. We don't live more than a few minutes without oxygen. What's back to us? So when we think we've got rid of it, we have to begin back to concentrate. Resource depletion is the third big category, and the fourth big category is loss of species and biodiversity. Each of these forms of global ecological change has an impact on health, an impact on our societies. And all four are going in the wrong direction at the same time, which is where the challenge comes. So we wanted to identify what are the drivers of these changes. We wanted to propose an action agenda. So we have a 30-page discussion document due out soon, a 90 to 100-page short version of the report, and a 350-page technical. So it's a major piece of work that I and my colleagues have been developing for the last few years. social change. We should remember that societies in history have collapsed because of ecological change. The Mayan civilization in Central America collapsed because of that. The Navajo, the Pueblo people in what is now Navajo country, Easter Island, if you've read a book, come across a book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, he documents a number of previous societies and civilizations that seem to have collapsed largely because their ecosystems collapsed. Took the society with them. So it's a two-way street. These interact. Then ecological change affects population health, social change affects population health, that's the social determinants, that's the ecological determinants, and public health in the centre potentially and needs to try and intervene in all of these different aspects. So we're calling this an eco-social model. It combines the ecological and the social. So what are some of the driving forces? This is a very famous equation shown graphically. It's called the IPAT equation. Impact on the Earth, equals population times affluence times technology. So when you have a very affluent community, the impact of one person is going to be much greater than the impact of a person in a less affluent. But a lot of people in an less affluent community will also have large. So it's a combination of those, and then technology. And this is just a very interesting example of some of those changes. So here's population. In 1900, the population was 1.8 billion. Now it's 7 billion. In 1950, it's 2.5 billion. In terms of affluence, world GDP has gone up from $2 trillion to 5.9 and now to $55 trillion. And technology, and they use patents as an example, went from 141,000 patents in the US in 1900 to 1.9 million today, acceleration of technology. So you put all that together, and you can see it, at least, and this is not a mathematically precise model, it's a conceptual model. But conceptually, you can see our impact on the Earth is down here, this little box down here, and now it's this whole cube here. So, because those multiply each other, the impact is massive. Our best hope, in some respects, is that if we get smart about technology, we could reduce those aerosol loading. So, the aerosols, the sulfur dioxide, chiefly particles, sulfur particles that affect the Earth's ability to reflect and not reflect solar energy. So all of those things are changing, and they then talk about the idea of planetary boundaries, and they suggest that there are a set of boundaries which you can estimate. We should not exceed those boundaries or we're in trouble. And what they're saying is that for genetic biodiversity, for loss of species, for extinctions, we have already passed the acceptable level. We have passed the acceptable level for both biochemical phosphorus flows and nitrogen flows. We are approaching it for land system change and climate change. So 2 degrees C change would be here. And for some of the other ones, like novel entities and atmospheric aerosol loading and what they call biodiversity intact index, we just don't know what the boundaries are. But we do know that we're beginning to cross theoretical planetary boundaries that spell big trouble for us. 2 of the core ones are climate change and biosphere integrity. They're connected to all of the others, and each in itself has the potential to drive the Earth system into a new state. And it is that process that becomes very troubling, because there is a concept, what we're talking about here is a complex adaptive system. And in complex adaptive systems, one of the things that can happen is called state shift, where you suddenly flip into a new state. process. You don't get a nice slow gradual process. You get bang, and change into a new state. And that possibility exists and hasn't happened in the past. We're in the midst of the fifth great extinction right now. That was one of the boundaries that was shown as being crossed. The difference is this great extinction is not caused by a meteor or by volcanoes or anything else, it's caused by us. So we are causing a mass extinction. That's one reason why we will show up in the geological record as the Anthropocene, because it will be a distinct change in fossils. We'll see in a million or 2 years, we'll see the great extinction, just as we can see Venus fire. The loss of Arctic sea ice is very rapid. Some of these things you get positive reinforcement. So with the thawing of permafrost, for example, you get methane release. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. So if you release a lot of methane, you accelerate global warming. When you accelerate global warming, you accelerate methane release. So it's a positive feedback loop, which triggers state change. That's a very troubling scenario. None of this is definitely going to happen, but it's increasingly probable that some, if not all of it, will. Health impacts, the important thing to understand from your point of view is it's complex, complicated as well as complex. So here are some of those changes that we just talked about in red. Another one in here is urbanization, food production, and so on, invasive species. And they all interact and they all have to, there will not be a test on this. You don't need to understand it, but it's in here that the impacts on lots of. That's the point. And how big they are and what they're due to is still science that you, as young public health students, are going to hopefully spend part of your life looking at and trying to understand so we can do something about it. Millennium Ecosystem Assessment said the ability of the planet's ecosystems to sustain future generations can no longer be taken for granted. That is a really scary thing. Think about it. It's saying we can't guarantee the future generations are going to survive because of what we're doing to the Earth today. So we can't go on the way we are. So our ultimate message is that the population health impacts of the ecological determinants of health are large. They're comparable to impacts of social determinants, and they interact with each other. So we need to undertake an eco-social approach to this. So I'm going to stop there. I have some other slides that we might come back to, but I want to pass this on to Tony and have a chance for you to have some discussion after that.
Thanks very much, Trevor. I think you've really set the scene there. Yes, about how to integrate these new understandings into the work we do. So I'm going to speak now for about 15 to 20 minutes. We are going to aim to finish still on time at 5:15 because we know that you've got buses to catch. Many of you at 5:30. So what I'm going to speak briefly about the global urban transition, the concept of co-benefits, which is a positive message in this context, the value of systems thinking, and then briefly about the way we might conceptualize health and sustainable development as we move through a discussion at the outset. And in Trevor's remarks, that we're in the midst of a global urban transition, to remind us of what's happening from the point of view of population. If we look at these world population estimates from the UN, from 2050 here on the left, the total population of the world, these purple bars, rising by estimation in 2030 up beyond the important thing about this data are these two lines, the red line and the blue line. So the red line are the people living in cities, and the blue line are people living in the countryside. And you can see that here in 2015, we've just passed the point where now more people live in cities than in the countryside for the first time in human history. And henceforth, most population growth will be in all countries, in cities. And indeed, cities around the world are growing by more than 1 million people every week. So that's an enormous challenge for us to manage. In 2006, at the Australian Academy of Science, a number of us got together for a conference on urbanism, environment and health. It was on the way we live in cities, urbanism, the consequences for the environment and the consequences for our health. And I might just point out here in the front row, Professor Tony McMichael, who many of you may have read his writings in this eco-social work, his very important seminal writing on planetary overload in the early 1990s. This was one of Tony's first slides at that conference, and it's on the theme of transport systems and health. And my message is not for you to read every word on the slide, but to see that there is a lot going on when we're thinking about urban transport systems and the health of people. The transport system here in Calcutta, for example, the transport system in other cities in India, around the world. The transport system we have in any city is partly inherited, evolved and planned. It reflects the history of the place, but also our values, preferences and theories in the context of urban development. And you can see that the transport system has consequences for energy, for the mix of modes, the infrastructure that we build, and as a potential major source of urban air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and also noise, and our ability to move in the city, our ability to walk safely, to cycle safely, with these flow-on consequences for human health and well-being here in red. There is potentially an array of health implications. So there's a lot going on when we think about these linkages. At that conference, this is difficult for you to see, I realise. One of the things that came from it was the schema, and in fact you'll have access to all of these slides because they've copied them onto the drive here. And this framework for thinking about the sustainability of cities and the health of people. And just, I don't need you to read every word, but on this axis we've divided what constitutes a city into the economy and work, the transport and urban layout, the housing and buildings, nature and landscape opportunity, media and communication, and cultural and spiritual dimensions. And many people responsible for decision making in cities are responsible for one of those domains. On this axis, the vertical axis, we've identified both social and environmental determinants of health. As Trevor was saying before, the air, the water, the allergens, the chemical exposures, local climatic conditions, food security, physical activity, safety, family relationships, and social capital. And in aggregate, these social and environmental determinants will ultimately determine our health and well-being from both physical and mental perspectives. And the essence of this schema is that sorry, I think you can roll up again. My fingers are too big for the control domain. The cells in this grid are where we can ask research questions, urban planning questions with our colleagues in other sectors. This quote, which you may have seen from the Lancet Commission on Climate Change Impacts back in 2009, climate change is potentially the biggest planetary goal, and there'll be flow-on impacts from the health of the planetary system to our health, as Trevor has illustrated few words about the value of systems thinking. In public health, we conventionally use epidemiology to understand our health state and the relationships between our health state and our circumstances. Systems thinking can add to what we can learn from epidemiology because it helps us understand the dynamics of those interactions and the concept of feedback, as Trevor was mentioning before, in the context of Arctic sea ice, for example. Why we're stuck? Why are policies resistant to change? Where are the opportunities to change? And what might be unintended consequences from our interventions? Because in the decisions we make, we often move quickly onto the next phase of thinking without evaluating what we can learn from what we've already done. And if we come back to think about urban transport systems again from a systems perspective, we can see that here the relationships between urban transport, land use and health and well-being, the travel we have to do in cities can have multiple pathways for effect on health, directly through toxic emissions and also secondarily through carbon emissions, through different timescales, directly through travel-related injury, physical activity, as I mentioned. And the impact of emissions is influenced by the mix of fuels. So if cars are electric, then there's less local pollution. But importantly, if we're still in motor cars, we are still central in those motor cars. So while they may be low carbon ways of living, they're not necessarily allowing the active travel on the waterways. In the blue here, we can see that beyond that, when we're thinking about how we might intervene from a public health point of view, we need to think about transport policies and land use policies, the infrastructure available, the distances between things that we need to access, where we live, where we work, where we learn in cities. And importantly, as from my earlier slide, these are all influenced by our attitudes, values and preferences, and potentially either in positive or negative ways by the subsidies and tax interventions that we put in place. So this is moving towards a systems understanding to guide our thinking about interventions. This work is being further developed through a new global program launched in December in Xiamen in China. It's been led by the International Council for Science on health and well-being in changing urban environments using systems approaches. And I'd encourage you to look at that website if you're interested in learning more about the program. A few words about the post-2015 development agenda. The big difference, as you may be aware, between our current approach to development, guided by Millennium Development Goals, and what's being proposed by the UN system in the post-2015 agenda is the intent to integrate our approach to sustainable development with our focus on poverty reduction. And the big difference internationally is that all countries will need to sign up to this agenda, not just low and middle income countries. It's just as important for the high income countries because they need to change too. High income countries need to contract per capita consumption between our planetary systems and our health. So you're welcome to join the community practice. You can just look online for